welcome to Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria, a Catholic Response. The topic of this lecture is on Chapter 8, Sections 2 through 5 of the section on Neurodevelopmental Etiology, which means origins, the possible causes of transgenderism or gender dysphoria. This goes along with the book, Transgender Ideology and Gender Dysphoria. If you would like the book, you can go to the link in the description. So we picked up from section 8.1, which dealt with psychological elements. Now you can, again, the psychological elements could be either a cause in and of themselves and their own independent thing, or they could be also pointing towards a neurodevelopmental cause for things like schizophrenia or autism, things like that. So if the psychology points to a possible neurodevelopmental cause, well, how does that work, right? Where does that come from? And the primary theory is this hormone-induced cephalic differentiation. That's the primary source of the theory for this, which came out in the 90s. And it's this idea that while in the womb, the body did not properly absorb, the mind did not properly absorb the proper hormones. Therefore, when the brain pathways were being created, there were crossed wires, right, in a sense, and it created these abnormalities. That's it in a nutshell. So could this be true? Like what points to this? Well, some studies have shown that male to female individuals are 3 times more likely to be left-handed. So the brain's forming, the abnormality of left-handedness also is neurodevelopmental. Female to male individuals were taller than cis women, right? Could there be a correlation? Female to male individuals, they have a ligament that goes from the sternum to the lateral margin that's bigger than non-transgender women. And 6 different studies have shown higher rates of polycystic ovaries in transgender female to male individuals without hormones or surgery. So there's some abnormalities within the person that's not directly related, right? It doesn't deal with gender dysphoria, but could there have been a developmental event which creates multiple phenotypes, right? Forms, morphologies. That's what this is claiming. Now the claim, you can read it in the book specifically, I have the whole section, but came from Tanya White, who presented to the Second International Congress of Sex and Gender. This is the claim, I think it was 96 or something like that. Between 18 and 24 weeks, neural apoptosis, which is the killing off of cells in development, takes place. So in this, we have, in kind of layman's terms, to think about it, when you're a newborn baby, you have a very undeveloped brain at that point, but also, it's growing at an extremely high rate. Right? You have a brain, but it's not fully developed, right? It's not, the pathways have not been developed. So in this 18 to 24 week period, some of the connectivity, all of the brain is connected with this tissue, but what's happens during that period is a cutting, right? There's a cutting of these pathways. Now this takes place in everyone. And about half of these glial cells die off, apoptosis, they die off, and it leaves certain pathways which, if you look at a fully formed adult brain, there's certain pathways, right? There's the white matter pathways, as tubes, as ways in which the brain is structured, right? It's the structuring of the brain. And this happens not by adding, but really subtracting, right? It kills off half these cells, leaving pathways which are then useful. This, again, this isn't a theory. This is actually how it works for most people, right? I might not be explaining it the best, but this is how it happens in general, right? The right side of the brain starts pruning 10 days before the left side of the brain. And these is like a migration of cells, right? When you're at the earliest stage, the brain left and right are kind of equal. There's no pathways, and things begin to migrate to the left side of the brain, which results in most of us being right-handed, right? This is part of the brain migration, the pathway migration. The brain isn't actually moving from one side of the head to another, just to be clear. It's these pathways, right? These highways. Think of it as highways, right? You have a whole country that's just forest. Well, that's the earliest brain, but eventually you end up with pathways, right? Roads, and then you get cities and towns, and it becomes interconnected, right? I guess that's one way to look at it, right? So these roads are being built in the brain. Now, if testosterone has a lot to do with trimming or not trimming, right? And the hormones have a lot to do with this as well, because females have certain structures in the brain because their brain is in estrogen, and men have different structures that are being formed at this time because their brain is sitting in testosterone, right? So this is forming. There's greater connectivity between left and right brain for females than there is for men, which affects language skills. Other things are going on within the male brain because of testosterone, causing better eye-hand coordination and other things like this. We've already gone over the differences between the male and female brain in chapter 7.1, right? If you go back to there, if you want to go through all the differences between the male and female brain, go back to that one. If some of this does not take place correctly because of testosterone, you could get something like dyslexia, right? The reversing. And so it's like the roads got crossed, right? There's a cross in the roads. This happens more in males than in females because it's related to testosterone. Now, females have testosterone too, and males have estrogen too. But so it can happen in both, but it's more common in males because of the testosterone. These crossing of paths and these pathways in the brain and the forming of the brain at this point, if things go wrong at this point, right, if pathways get crossed, could this then result in a male or female body, but crossed paths in the brain in terms of gender identity? That's it in a nutshell. That's the claim. Say, well, how could this take place, right? That's how do you have these, these crossroads, right? Think of telephone wires. How do you get the wires crossed in this? Well, here are three. Here's two good possibilities, right? Here's two possibilities. There for male to female, natal males, right? Born male. This study in 2009 by Hare, who's in Australia. She was repeating a study that had smaller results, and they came to different conclusions. So she repeated it and got different results. But her study seems to be the better one. She found that with 112 transgender men to female and 258 cisgender non-transgender males as subject pool, pretty good study. It found within when looking at androgens, right? Androgens, the body produces androgens. They're received and they're turned into testosterone for men. That's the goal. Androgens turn into testosterone. If they are not, right, the body's putting off these androgens. If they are not being received and turned into testosterone, they get longer chains, right? Because there's more of it in the fluid, right? There's more of it in the fluid. I was trying to turn this into something simple. If they were being received, they would be turned into testosterone. But if they're not being received, they kind of link together and make longer and longer chains. So they're finding in people who were male to female transgender longer chains of androgens, meaning they're not being absorbed. So the body is not absorbing the androgens and turning them into testosterone quickly enough. Okay, I hope that's clear. Well, what happens if the body is not turning androgens into testosterone in the womb? Well, then the brain is not being properly masculinized. The brain is not sitting in a pool of testosterone because there's a backlog, right? There's a backup of androgens being turned into testosterone. They are essentially, the body is producing the androgens, but the body's not processing it correctly. Therefore, there is a testosterone deficiency, which then will affect the brain. And there's a very limited time frame for getting this right in the brain, right? This 18 to 24 week period, right? You only got 6 weeks, right? You got a month and a half to masculinize the brain. And if it's not being masculinized you're not masculinizing the brain at that point, you're going to have abnormalities, right? Because you're not going to get a fully formed male brain at that point, right? If you have testosterone deficiency as an adult, right, you notice it, and then you can take pills, and you can, when it comes to your body. But in the womb, your brain is crystallizing, right? It's crystallizing. There's an apoptosis of the cells. It's happening very quickly, and it's forming, right? You don't have 10 years to figure this out. You have 6 weeks to figure it out, and you wouldn't know because you're in the womb, right? It's early stages of development. What Hare claims is it is possible that the decreased testosterone levels in the brain during the development might result in an incomplete masculinization of the brain in male to female transsexuals, resulting in a more feminized brain and a female gender identity. That's the claim. Now, well, this seems to make some sense. Well, what is the problem with this then? Well, if we go back to chapter 4 on the section of intersex, we saw this, right? People who are complete androgen insensitivity. They couldn't absorb the androgens. Well, what happens to a male who can't absorb testosterone? They develop a female body, right? They develop female sex organs and they appear female, right? They are fully feminized. Okay, that's complete androgen insensitivity. Now there is also partial, PAIS, partial androgen insensitivity. This also occurs. It causes intersex, right? It causes intersex. This we can physically see, right? You can look at the body and you can test it and you can see that there is an insensitivity to androgens. They're not absorbing it entirely or not absorbing it partially, and it means a demasculinized brain, a demasculinized body, right? I think it's clear, right? That we would call intersex, right? This claim here is that the body is fully masculinized, right? But the brain has not been masculinized to some degree. Okay, this is now a different thing, right? So how does the body fully masculinized without the testosterone, right? Even if it just means partially, not as much testosterone, the body fully masculinizes, but for some reason one section of the brain does not, right? This is somewhat of an unusual claim, right? This is not, if you the intersex makes sense, right? Because there's a deficiency in testosterone that's going to affect the whole body, including the brain. To say that it will only affect the gender identity section of the brain, but not large parts of the rest of the body or brain, is an unusual claim. However, this seems there's a higher rate of these polymorphic genes, unabsorbed androgens, in male to female transgender people than there are in the general male population. So it points to something. It is not definitive of anything, but it points to something, right? The complete opposite of this would be these hormones that are being produced. They should be getting absorbed and turned into estrogen. So for females, they should be producing estrogen. Right, the opposite, right? The males should be turning it into testosterone, but they're not. The female should be turning it into estrogen, but they're not. So when they look at this in the females, this is also taking place in female to male transgender. This is a study done in 2014 by Rosa Fernandez, 273 female to male individuals, 371 non-transgender females. So in a normal situation, the body is, this picture might help, is producing these hormones. The hormones then need to be absorbed, right? They need to be producing estrogen. The estrogen should be absorbed, and then that leads to a feminization of the child in the womb. That's how it takes place, right? And that affects the feminization of the brain and the body. Now, you could have a situation where there is an insufficient production of estrogen, right? The body's not producing the estrogen, so there's nothing to absorb, so then there's not a feminization, right? It's not a feminization taking place. And then all you have is the androgens in the body, and the body will masculinize. But it won't feminize. The other thing is the body is producing the estrogen, but the body is not absorbing the estrogen. If the body doesn't absorb the estrogen, then the estrogen kind of builds up, and you get these longer chains, the ERβ gene. You end up with these longer chains of estrogen because they're not being absorbed, right? They're backing up and they're linking together rather than being absorbed. And this will lead to, as well, a lack of feminization of the brain and body of the individual in the womb. The claim then is that this could create a transgender male, right? A female who is masculinized, not feminized. The problem with this is the exact same as the AR gene for male to female, right? For there to be androgen insensitivity, complete or partial, it should affect the entire body, that it only affects gender identity and nothing else, right? Some of these earlier studies that we looked at, Chapter 7, maybe it affects something in the hypothalamus, maybe it affects white matter, maybe it affects a little bit of gray matter, right? It's affecting something in the brain. It's not completely feminizing or masculizing the brain. It's creating abnormalities, right? There's abnormalities here. But it's not fully intersex, right? So again, the kind of claim here then is that there is an intersex component going on, I guess in a minor way, because it's not manifesting itself the way intersex does, but it is on the spectrum of intersex, right? That would be the claim here. The claim is not without problems, but it is possible, right? It's not saying it's probable, but it is possible. In these two studies, they kind of point to the idea that these longer hormone chains are signs that the body is not absorbing the proper hormones, and there's a higher amount of these hormones in transgender people. So that is a fairly good study, right? That's kind of helpful. The next, and this one's a bit on the limb, out on a limb. I'll be honest with you on that one, but I think it's still interesting enough. But dealing with body integrity identity disorder, you might know this one through a kind of famous example. So people who say, I feel like I should not have an arm. I feel like I don't have an arm, but I do have an arm. But I feel like I shouldn't have an arm. Right? This is body integrity identity disorder. Or I feel like I should be handicapped and in a wheelchair, but I can walk. But I feel like I shouldn't be able to walk. Right? This is body integrity identity disorder. They're very odd ideas. We can't really grasp it, and we often make fun of these types of things because they don't make a lot of sense. So there's the BDD, Body Dysmorphic Disorder Foundation, which also deals with body integrity identity disorder. BDD is more, we're maybe more familiar with that. That's people who might have an eating disorder, might have a BDD where they see themselves as fat, but instead they're so thin that they're sick, but they still see themselves as fat. That's BDD. BIID is similar, but there's this. It's not about weight; it's about these other factors, and they usually they want to see the thing gone, right? They want the arm amputated. They want to be handicapped. They want to, they want this to happen. Antonia Oskath did a study with this and found that there is a lot of similarities between this, right? So in both cases, people have healthy bodies, but they interpret their bodies as being incorrect in some way, right? I see a man in the mirror, but I feel like I'm a woman, or I see a able-bodied person in the mirror, but I feel as if I'm a handicapped person. Right? This is a matter of the brain not matching, the thought not matching the reality. Right? This is a similarity here. When she looked at people with BIID and people with gender dysphoria, very small study, so I don't know how much we can put into it, but both groups could not rationally explain their desires, but most 75, which is people with BIID, and 73.7% of people with gender dysphoria attribute it to biological genetic reasons. They claim it is biological. It says, regarding the question of body image and body perception, the hypothesis would be proven that BIID sufferers and transsexuals have a strong feeling that their biological identity does not match their mental body image. So they're around 75%. There's a similarity there. The average for first realizing that they have this for BIID is 10.7 years, and for transgender 13 years on average. When these groups started experimenting with these ideas, BIID started to fake disabilities around 14.8 years old, and transsexuals started cross-dressing at the age of 13.46 years old. I suspect that the group of transgender people that they used were androphilic, right, homosexual type transgender people. There does seem to be a connection. There's a similarity here, and there is the idea that BIID might be also neurodevelopmental, right? Why does a person think that they should have their arm removed? Why does a person feel like they're handicapped? This isn't usually because of some type of trauma of some kind. These are otherwise sometimes very normal people. Could this be also a neurodevelopmental thing? And similar. I'll get into BDD, right, body dysmorphic disorder, a bit later on. So I hope this is helpful. The point of it is this is the primary medical argument, right? Transmedicalists would say, this is probably hormones didn't get absorbed in the body during development, and this is why I have a female or male identity, right? It's in the brain, it's a medical thing, right? This is transmedicalists, this is what they would claim. Gender theorists who say, well, I'm a non-binary, or there's no evidence of any medical thing for that, right? Or gender fluid, there's nothing specifically for that, but for people who have gender dysphoria that might be medically driven, this would be the best explanation we have today. So I hope that is helpful.